Good morning. For time's sake, I'll jump into my presentation, but thank you very much for your invitation. I tried to link up with a remark, also made by our colleague from DSM, that also the investor's perspective is very important. I think my main point that I tried to make here is that among the actors that play a role in land acquisitions, and I concentrate on foreign land acquisitions in this presentation, I think the least well known is that of the land grabbers, the investors themselves. Actually, I have a slide on that. It matters for our purpose to get to know them a little bit better, also because they're possibly an important part of better solutions. We tend to think of them in stereotypes that are familiar to all of us here. You have the typical Arab oil state investment fund securing production of foodstuffs in Africa. You have the, sorry Yongyan, the Chinese sneaking into Africa and to get hold of natural resources. You have the Western companies doing shady deals, land deals across the world. And all of that is true. But of course, it's only part of reality. And there's a wide diversity of investors. Some of them, and quite a few of them, actually quite honest people. So what we propose in this paper, which is part of the Landtag activity, is a twofold objective. The first part, which will be done by my colleague Irma Mosquera, a lawyer, which I'm not, concentrates on the regulatory framework that actually guides the behavior of investors. And the second part is the actor perspective on who are the investors, how do they look at things, and what can we arrange with them. Of course, all in the dignified purpose of achieving inclusive and sustainable growth, possibly even development. The first part then concerns this regulatory framework. Annelies Somers already mentioned in the first presentation that actually the sort of land acquisition processes that now attract a lot of media attention are a logical consequence of what we have been doing for several decades. In a way, you could see it as the success of structural adjustment programs. So, what are we surprised about? Much of the rule making about this is enshrined in multilateral agreements, much of it in the WTO framework, which has liberalized investment flows and trade flows, which has elaborated non-discrimination principles, national treatment, for instance, which means that you cannot treat foreign investors in a different way than you treat your domestic investors, which should create a level playing field for everybody. But if the foreign investor is an enormous company and on the other side you have local smallholders, then you may wonder how level that playing field actually is. Another important point here is the fact that a lot of this rule making has withdrawn the ability of host countries to impose conditions on investors that could serve their development. Rather less developed or less well documented than this multilateral framework are, well, the important domestic reforms that have been taking place in almost all developing countries. Of course, that varies per country, but there is a generalized trend towards liberalization in that. And already mentioned by both Michael and by Mathieu, is the bilateral investment agreements, of which some 2,500 are now deemed to be in operation, and investment contracts, international investment contracts, which may contain things like stabilization clauses, basically that insulates the investor against any other new policy that the receiving country may launch. Or it may offer options for the investor to have conflicts settled in, well, a jurisdiction of their purpose, of their selection. You end up then with this legal patchwork in which some parts of a country are in fact subject to a different set of laws, and when this foreign investment plays a role, often a rather more liberalized type of legislation than what applies in domestic legislation. Then the second perspective, which I would be concentrating on, is this actor thing, is who actually are these investors, and well, what can we get from them? I think the most interesting part of this exercise would perhaps be to come to some sort of a typology, which could make an inventory of what type of investor could end up with some sort of what sort of results in terms of development and inclusion and sustainability. I would like to propose, well, something like this. In the first place, I see companies who are interested in using land for productive purposes. Well, that is very attractive, certainly from an economist's point of view. That's the sort of investment that brings new technology, that could link local producers into global value chains, that increases productivity because of capital investment. But it's also where much of the risks are concentrated, because these new activities may entail dislocation and exclusion at the local level. Then there is a second type of investor who are not interested in using the land, but who see land as a good vehicle for investment, since land prices are likely to go up over time. The first side, you would say, they have less impact locally, since they're not actually using the land. On the second side, actually, there may be some counterproductive forces here, because if the investor is not really using the land as such, well, positive consequences of the investment then are not likely to follow, and you may end up with unproductive uses, with speculative reserves. Most of you will be familiar with wide areas around major cities in developing countries which are exactly suffering from a lot of this. And so that's a counterproductive result. And then there is a third type of investor that I would like to draw attention to. That's the indirect investor. They're not grabbing land, they're not investing in land, but they are funding the companies that are acquiring land. Well, of course, in the first place, they are not very much involved. They are not actually at the site itself. But potentially they have a lot of influence on the whole process, because on the one hand, they are the investors that are forcing the actual producers to meet certain productivity standards, certain benefit standards, profit standards. On the other hand, they're also the sort of parties, think of pension funds and major asset funds, who are sensitive to sticking to codes of conduct. And they may be useful in, well, imposing better practices. When just in some preliminary interviews talking with a number of investors, it's actually quite an interesting thing. You get a dramatic shift of perspective when you talk with people who actually are concerned with land, buying land in a developing country. The bad culprit suddenly turns into a rather insecure and worrisome person. In the first place, because of lack of security. In a lot of developing countries, the whole legal framework may actually not be in place, or, much more important, may not be enforceable. So you get complaints from investors that, well, I have an arrangement, but then the person who gave me this license is not, well, appears not to be entitled to that. I have to go to another authority, and nobody can tell me what the proper procedure is. Enforcement problems I also mentioned. Then there are all sorts of local conditions, or perhaps the national level, that may play an important role. We talked with one investor who needed another piece of land to make a profitable tourist resort. He needs more land to start his operations. The local authority requires them first to build, and then he'll get the new land. This is a quite difficult conundrum for, well, for an investor. More generally, transaction costs, of course, are very high in many developing countries, and just one example of that is the time frame, which also was mentioned by Michael. Investors use credit. They need to be able to repay their loans according to a tight schedule, but when you are waiting for these authorities to, well, to come up with licenses for a land deal to materialize, this must easily draw out for years. And so you see the problem that here shows up. Actually, a lot of this explains why many of these land deals have never materialized. And they're somewhere in this process. And a key finding from preliminary interviews is the really very important role of local mediators. Simplifying things, without a good local middleman, you're nowhere as an investor. Of course, this does not apply to the really big ones, who directly deal with governments. But at the more local level, in most cases, this is really essential. Yeah, I'll skip this one because that is already covered to some extent by Michael. Just a preliminary conclusion. I think that for an investment to contribute to, well, to inclusive and sustainable growth and development, actually what is crucial is some sort of embeddedness. The closer the two parties actually are linked to each other, the foreign investor and local communities or local players, the better chances are. Which also means that a lot of these more, well, pirate type of investments are not likely to have a long life. And they will be kicked out by local communities. I think I'll leave that to it. Just a final slide on which I need not dwell in my presentation, but which you can consult on your printout is the sort of data sources that we intend to use for this paper.